Hello, and thank you for tuning into the Whiskey Report. I am your host, Miles Kristen. On today's episode, we are going to be talking about the 1980s. This is a decade that could be defined by so many things: the Soviet Empire, the Cold War, Ronald Reagan, the Berlin Wall, the Challenger disaster, the crack epidemic, the outbreak of AIDS, or just simply music. There are so many different things that we could be talking about on this decade for hours and hours. And sadly, we don't have enough time to go over all of it. So I will not be getting into the hair metal, the amazing hip hop and rap music that was made in the 80s. And sadly, we don't even have enough time to really scratch the surface of stories like the Iran-Contra scandal. But what we will talk about are some of the lesser known musicians of the 80s, groups like the Oppenheimer Analysts, and we're also going to talk about some of the movies that came out through the 1980s and talk about some of the news stories that you may have heard of and some you may not have heard of. But first, we're going to start with the year 1980. We're going to talk about a little bit of the music and stories that came out that year. In 1980, Joy Division released its second album, Closer, and these are a few songs from it.
Horrors of This is the way, step inside. 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 And I picked on the winds of 1,000 or more to pursue in the path that's been buried for years. All the dead was from jungles and cities on fire. Can't replace or relate, can't release or repair. Take my hand and I'll show you what was and will be.
And that was the first track off the second Joy Division album, Closer. This was the second and final album by Joy Division. Tragically, the lead singer Ian Curtis committed suicide in May of 1980. The remaining members of the band then later formed the group New Order, and we'll be playing some music from them later. The presidential election of 1980. This is where Jimmy Carter was up for re-election. The former governor of California, Ronald Reagan, former actor, was running actually against George Bush Sr. in the Republican primary, where Reagan would win and then George Bush Sr. would become his vice presidential running mate, along with another candidate as well. Now, I can't think of anybody who has documented this election as well and as short and concise as this man, Mr. Beat. If you have a chance, check out his YouTube channel, Mr. Beat. This guy puts together amazing history lessons in a very short, funny, and concise manner. So I'm going to start off with a clip from Mr. Beat.
Mr. Beat presents Presidential Elections in American History. The 49th presidential election in American history took place on November 4th, 1980, as President Jimmy Carter faced quite a few obstacles, and things just weren't all peachy. The country faced low economic growth, high inflation and interest rates, and an energy crisis, in which the prices of oil went way up since supply went down in certain areas. This shortage was partially caused by the Iranian Revolution of 1979, in which a new Islamic government hostile hostile to the United States overthrew the old one, and this soon led to the Iranian hostage crisis, in which 52 American diplomats and citizens were held hostage after a group of Iranian revolutionaries took over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Carter tried applying economic and diplomatic pressure on the Iranians to get the hostages released, but ultimately, by the time the election rolled around, he was unsuccessful freeing them. As Carter sought renomination by the Democratic Party, he did face challengers. His leading opponent was Ted Kennedy. This was the toughest primary race a sitting president had to go through to seek his party's renomination since President Taft sought renomination in the election of 1912, which, as you already know, ended up splitting the Republican Party. Carter and Kennedy were in a tight race, and some people tried to get Edmund Muskie, who is now the Secretary of State, to run against them both, just to break apart the deadlock between the two. It didn't work, but Carter had more delegates than Kennedy going into the convention, and he won renomination, with Walter Mondale also renominated for vice president. Ronald Reagan was easily the favorite to win the Republican nomination, but he did have several opponents, like George Herbert Walker Bush, the former CIA director and representative from Texas, or this dude, John B. Anderson, a U.S. representative from Illinois. Anderson stood out among the crowd of Republicans because of a great debate performance against his other Republican challengers. He eloquently expressed himself and said things none of the other candidates dared say, like saying that lowering taxes, increasing defense spending, and balancing the budget could not all happen at the same time. After this, Anderson got a lot of media attention. Still, no one could take on the popular Ronald Reagan, who it seems had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. Reagan got the nomination with Bush as his running mate. Meanwhile, Anderson had decided to leave the Republican Party and run as an independent candidate, mostly as a centrist, or as the moderate guy who argued that Reagan was much too conservative and Carter much too liberal. Patrick Lucey, a former Democratic governor of Wisconsin and ambassador to Mexico in the Carter administration, was Anderson's running mate. The Libertarian Party by this time had started to gain some momentum. They nominated Ed Clark, a lawyer who had previously ran for governor of California as the third-party candidate but lost. David Koch, a businessman and engineer from Kansas, was his running mate. Koch is one of the now famous, or infamous, depending on who you ask, Koch brothers. Koch pledged part of his personal fortune to the campaign. The two frontrunners, Reagan and Carter, had two distinct campaigns. Reagan ran a campaign of optimism, while Carter's campaign seemed to be a bit more negative, attacking Reagan for being too far to the right. Reagan called for more military spending, while at the same time calling for a smaller government. Wait. What? Carter's campaign had to defend the Iranian hostage crisis, support for the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution, which was supposed to guarantee equality for women but by 1980 was not as popular, and a struggling economy. Not only that, but when the League of Women Voters invited Carter to debate both Reagan and Anderson, Carter turned it down because Anderson was invited. So the debate was a bit weird, with just Reagan and Anderson going at it. Anderson was polling at around 20% at the time. After the debate, Anderson's poll numbers dropped, and the league asked Carter again to join just Reagan this time for a debate 1 week before the election. Carter accepted. The debate had really high ratings, and by most accounts, Reagan dominated, even though his campaign may have had access to Carter's notes preparing for the debate ahead of time. And here are the results. Ronald Reagan easily won, becoming the 40th president in American history. He received 489 electoral votes, the most ever for a president elected for the first time. Pretty impressive for a guy who was called a radical by opponents for so long. He also got a strong 50.7% of the popular vote. He was the oldest president ever elected. Jimmy Carter received just 49 electoral votes and 41% of the popular vote. In terms of the popular vote, this was the worst performance by an incumbent president in an election since Herbert Hoover in the election of 1932. In terms of the electoral vote, this was the most lopsided defeat for any incumbent president in an election where only two candidates received electoral votes. I know you're still alive, President Carter, so if you're watching this, I hope you skipped over this part. In third place, John Anderson, who didn't get electoral votes but received a respectable 6.6% of the popular vote. Anderson, who is also still alive, promptly faded into obscurity after this election. Ed Clark finished fourth with 1.1%, the best showing for the Libertarian Party up to that point. George H.W. Bush became the 43rd vice president in American history. Reagan was so popular popular that he helped the Republicans regain control of the Senate for the first time since 1952. This election marked the beginning of what became known as the Reagan Revolution, which marked a dramatic conservative shift in national politics. Within minutes after Reagan was sworn into office, the Iranian hostages were formally released. And of course, Reagan got all the credit, even though the Carter administration did all the work.
Lately, honey, you can't dress and slash it till you spend a lot of money.
I'll see you for the next election, buddy.
Everybody's talking about the new sound, funny, but it's still rock and roll to me. What's the matter with the car I'm driving? Can't you tell that it's out of style?
Once again, that was Mr. Beat. I would definitely subscribe to his YouTube channel. It's just Mr. BEAT. He is a teacher who puts together amazing history lessons on everything from Supreme Court trials to elections and so forth. He does amazing history in a short, concise, and funny way. Now, about a month after the election of 1980, we saw the horrible tragedy, which was the assassination of former Beatle John Lennon. John Lennon was signing autographs in New York City when Mark David Chapman shot and killed him. This was just a few months after he and Yoko Ono had released the album Double Fantasy. We'll now play a couple songs from that album.
Close your eyes, have no fear. The monster's gone, he's on the run, and your daddy's here. Beautiful, 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 beautiful boy. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Before you go to sleep, say a little prayer. Every day, in every way, it's getting better and better. Beautiful, 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 beautiful boy. Beautiful, 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 beautiful boy. Out on the ocean, sailing away. I can hardly wait to see you come of age. But I guess we'll both just have to be patient, 'cause it's a long way to go, a hard road to hoe. Yes, it's a long way to go, but in the meantime, before you cross the street, take my hand. Life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans. Beautiful, 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 beautiful boy. Beautiful, 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 beautiful boy. Before you go to sleep, say a little prayer. Every day,
Once again, my name is Miles Kristen, and you have been listening to the Whiskey Report on Corsair Radio, sponsored by Discourse Coffee, a liquid space in Sister Bay, Wisconsin.
People say I'm crazy, doing what I'm doing. Well, they give me all kinds of warnings to save me from ruin. When I say that I'm okay, well, they look at me kind of strange. Surely you're not happy now, you no longer play the game. People say I'm lazy, dreaming my life away. Well, they give me all kinds of advice designed to enlighten me. Watching shadows on the wall. Don't you miss the big time, boy, you're no longer on the ball. I'm just sitting here watching the wheels go round and round. I really love to watch them roll. No longer riding on the merry-go-round. Questions, lost in confusion. Well, I tell them there's no problem, only solutions. Well, they shake their heads and they look at me as if I've lost my mind. I tell them there's no hurry, I'm just sitting here doing time. I'm just sitting here watching the wheels go round and round. I really love to watch them roll. No longer riding on the merry-go-round. I just had to let it go. I just had to let it go. I just had to let it go.
Okay, you just heard a few songs off the album Double Fantasy by John Lennon and Yoko Ono. We will now go into 1981. On March 30th of 1981, President Ronald Reagan was shot outside of a DC hotel after speaking before the AFL-CIO union. He was shot and wounded by John Hinckley Jr. Hinckley also shot 3 others who luckily all survived. That same year, we saw the first of the Indiana Jones series with Raiders of the Lost Ark. Now for some music from 1982. And this is a musical duo that you probably don't know much about. It is something I only discovered about a year ago. The name of this group was called the Oppenheimer Analysts, and I think it's incredibly interesting work. This is, early 80s. These guys put together this electronic music that for some reason is not as well known as it should be. I think these are amazing pieces of work. Andy Oppenheimer of Oppenheimer Analysts, an amazingly interesting musician from Britain, has produced music, has written sci-fi novels, and also has worked as a I want to say counterterrorism expert or somehow in that world of counterterrorism. And so the first song I'm going to play by them is the song New Mexico.
Just off the beaten track, way from the Vegas track. No more shiny Hollywood bowl. New York streets have lost their soul. Take me where it's desolate. Leave my senses in the clouds, worlds away from city crowds. Into the valley of the bomb, going for a desert song. See the nuclear family pointing to the sky at me. There's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to go. In the land of enchantment, the land of enchantment, New Mexico, New Mexico. This is the place to be a stranger from another space. Everyone's a stranger there. See the redneck stop and stare. Leave me in the scorching air. The blood is going to flow from the place I love, New Mexico. Listen here to Moonface Mike, tell you all what it was like to light the sky not so long ago. Not so long ago, in crimson red, hills so dead, suns that fled in burning red, New Mexico, New Mexico. See the rednecks, watch the skies, flying saucers, myths and lies, myths and lies. Snakes are rattling on the ground, wriggling into what they found, gouged out holes of reptile eyes. See the rednecks, watch the skies in the Megadeth birthplace, in the Megadeth birthplace, New Mexico. The white sands of time. enchantment, in the land of enchantment, New Mexico, New Mexico. See the rednecks stop and stare, leave me in the scorching air. The blood is going to flow from the place I love, New Mexico. White sands of time are losing face, running down and going slow. In the land of enchantment, in the land of enchantment, New Mexico, New Mexico. See the nuclear family pointing to the sky at me. There's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to go. In the land of enchantment, in the land of enchantment, New Mexico, New Mexico, New Mexico. White sands of time are losing face, running down and going slow. In the land of enchantment, in the land of enchantment, New Mexico, New Mexico. See the rednecks, watch the skies, watch the skies. Flying saucers, myths and lies, myths and lies. The blood is going to flow from the place I love, New Mexico.
Okay, that was New Mexico by Oppenheimer Analysts, and here's another song by them called Cold War. That was Cold War by the Oppenheimer Analysts. 1982 was a great year if you love sci-fi movies. We saw E.T. the Extraterrestrial and Blade Runner. And here's a song from 1983 by the band Big Country called In a Big Country.
So take that look out of here, it doesn't fit you. Because it's happened doesn't mean you've been discarded. Pull up your head up the floor, come up screaming. Cry out for everything you ever might have wanted. I thought the pain and truth of things that really matter, but you can't stay here with every single one you have shattered. I'm not expecting to grow flowers in the desert, but I can live and breathe and see the sun in winter time. In a big country, dreams stay with you like a lover's voice sparks the mountainside. Stay alive. In a big country, dreams stay with you like a lover's voice sparks the mountainside. Stay alive. In a big country, dreams stay with you like a lover's voice sparks the mountainside. Stay alive.
And that was the song In a Big Country by the band Big Country from 1983. In the year 1983, we also saw the Canadian cult classic Strange Brew starring Rick Moranis and Dave Thomas. This is one of those movies that you're not usually going to see on a major streaming platform. You know, this is why it's good to have a VCR, because a lot of these classic films that came out in the 80s that are possibly less known, you know, you got a VCR and that's how you're going to see it. Like, for instance, the movie starring Arsenio Hall called Amazon Women of the Moon. It's one of those
movies, it's kind of a whole bunch of spoofs and skits of sorts. Things like that, it's great to have a VCR because you can go to a secondhand shop and find these old, great classic VHS films. And now we need to talk about one of the news events from 1983.
And in doing research for this episode, I came across the story of Flight 007, and I was shocked to learn about this story. It was a plane that was shot down in the ocean not too far from Russia, and this was, of course, in the middle of the Cold War. This resulted in the deaths of more than 260 people, including a U.S. congressman who was actually a Democrat and the chair of the John Birch Society. And this just led to more tension between the United States and Russia. So I'm going to play a news clip about that story.
Thus came the end of an unarmed civilian jet and its unsuspecting passengers. The death of Flight 7. Anxiety had started to mount when the flight from New York to Seoul, with a stop in Anchorage, wasn't heard from for several hours. First reports said the plane had been forced down on the Soviet-controlled Sakhalin Island, which is off northern Japan. Then came the unavoidable savage truth. When the big jet had disappeared from Japanese flight control radar, it had disappeared from the sky itself, obliterated with up to 269 people aboard by a heat-seeking missile fired by a Soviet Su-15 interceptor. Among those presumed dead, United States Senator Larry MacDonald and at least 30, possibly 40 other Americans and an Australian family of 4. In Washington, Secretary of State Schultz said this was no accident. He described how the Soviet hunters tracked their prey.
Aircraft for 2.5 hours, at least 8 fighters at one time or another were around in the vicinity, and the aircraft that shot the plane down was close enough for visual inspection of the aircraft.
President Reagan, at his Californian ranch, was said to have been briefed continually. Spokesman Larry Speaks expressed the president's disgust.
Words can scarcely express our revulsion at this horrifying act of violence.
A spokesman for Korean Airlines insisted that the plane was exactly where it was supposed to be.
I strongly believe that our aircraft must be on course.
But in Tokyo, Japanese air controllers said not true, that Flight 7 was substantially off course and well into Soviet airspace, over some of the most sensitive and jealously guarded airspace the Soviets have. Because underneath is a nuclear submarine base, an air fighter base, and a missile testing range. From Moscow, the silence was deafening. TASS said only that the Soviet fighters were trying to help an unidentified aircraft land, but that it ignored their warnings and continued flying unimpeded, said the Soviets, towards the Sea of Japan.
Now from 1984, this is Charming Man by the Smiths.
Complexity when the leather runs smooth on the passenger seat. I would go out tonight, but I haven't got a stitch to wear. This man said it's gruesome that someone so handsome should care. A jumped up country boy never knew his place. He said, return the ring. He knows so much about these things. He knows so much about these things. I would go out tonight, but I haven't got a stitch
And now a interview that I did with Canadian radio host Mark Petroni. He is a news talk radio host out of Mississauga, right near Toronto in the province of Ontario. He is a little bit more on the conservative side, and this is just one perspective of somebody who is older than myself, who lived through the 1980s, and what they saw as far as the political climate of the time. Once again, this is an interview with Canadian radio host Mark Petroni. Well, first off, as far as music, what would you say were some of the greatest musical groups music made in the 80s?
Wow. Well, I mean, Guns N' Roses came out with Appetite for Destruction. I mean, that was sort of one of those seminal records, maybe one of the greatest debut albums in history. Hugely popular and remains a staple on classic rock radio. But you also had artists like in the pop realm, you know, like Madonna, for instance. Prince was huge. Michael Jackson. You know, Brothers in Arms came out with Mark Knopfler and Dire Straits. That was another huge album when CDs were coming in. And so those were some of the bands that were dominating the landscape at the time. And out of Britain, you had sort of the new wave, kind of new romantic sounds, you know, Spandau Ballet and bands like that. We used to listen to a lot of that stuff back in the day. So dance music, it was the disco. This was sort of the post-disco type of era. So you had sort of more of organic sounding disco music, like Chic, for instance, in the late 70s. And then in the 80s, it sort of morphed into more electronic type music, like New Order, and bands like that became huge in the dance areas and the discos. And so I mean, those were types of records that came out that were huge at the time. But yeah, there was a lot of great music that came out in the 80s.
And now, being in Canada, maybe it was a little bit, maybe the Cold War is a little different, but I mean, I guess anywhere you lived in the world, the Cold War was a serious thing. Looking back on the 1980s, and I mean, basically, we had Ronald Reagan, and then in 88 we got Vice President Bush became president. It was Trudeau's father prime minister in the 80s.
Okay, well, what happened was Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, was the prime minister early on in the 80s, so the first few years. But that was the end of the Trudeau era, the first Trudeau era. What came in after that in 1984, Brian Mulroney was one, perhaps the biggest, or maybe the second biggest, depends on who you ask, majority in. It was a massive victory for the Conservatives in 1984. And so he's what they used to call the progressive Conservative prime minister. And so he was certainly to the right of a guy like Pierre Trudeau and the Liberals. So he did move the needle conservatively somewhat, not enough for some people's liking, but he was certainly a big friend, a major friend of Reagan at the time. And the two of them, they would get together and have sort of this Irish kind of summit, and you sing When Irish Eyes Are Smiling and the rest of it. So they had a good time. They had a very good rapport, very good relationship. And Mulroney was able to get some agreement from the United States on acid rain at the time was a big issue. And so they were able to reach that. And then the other thing that Mulroney pushed a little later on was the free trade agreement. So you had NAFTA at the time, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and it began between Mulroney and Reagan. They got together, their staffs got together, administrations, and said, well, how do we make this work? How do we reduce the regulations between our two countries in order to, make things better for jobs on both sides, and we don't have to bother with so much red tape, and we can both grow and we can both improve our economies. And so they struck this deal, and then there was another election in 1988, which Mulroney won again, and which basically sealed the deal in terms of this agreement, this NAFTA agreement between Canada, the United States, and then Mexico came along. So they had an excellent relationship, but they also had a lot of agreement in terms of forming an alliance against what was then the Soviet bloc. Okay, so at that time you had Soviet Russia and a host of satellite nations which were very much under the thumb of Moscow at the time. Countries like Romania and Czechoslovakia before that splintered. You had East Germany, and let's see if I can name them all here. I know Hungary. There was little countries as well that were kind of part of Russia and kind of not, like Latvia and those sorts of countries like that, Estonia. And so you had all those countries and forming that bloc in the East. You had China off doing kind of its own things because, yeah, we thought of them as part of the communist bloc, but they were as much at odds with Soviet Russia as almost we were, because they would have border skirmishes and border issues and sort of thing, and so neither of them trusted each other. And so at the time you had Mulroney and Reagan, and of course you had Thatcher in the UK, who was a conservative, and you also had, I believe it was Helmut Kohl in what was then West Germany. And so between those leaders, you had this solid foundation of opposition to the Soviets. And so Reagan really did some things which led to the end of the Soviet bloc. And it was that opposition, that refusal to appease to the Soviet bloc, and basically outspending the Soviets. But there were other aspects to the fall of the Soviet Union towards the end of that decade. And Reagan was key to helping make that happen. And so that led to the fall of the Soviet bloc and a movement into more of what we have today. And what happened in the early 90s under Clinton was and Chrétien up here, who was prime minister at the time, was bringing China into the World Trade Organization. And so that turned out to be a fateful decision, one which I dare say was a terrible idea. I mean, at the time, some of the reasoning was, well, we'll let China in, and over time, they'll become more like a liberal democracy. But it was a stupid idea, because all it did was made them rich, or made them richer anyway. It strengthened their economy immeasurably. They sort of took on some trappings of capitalism without the freedom side, but became as totalitarian as ever. And so they continued to get richer. They built up their military. And so that led to what we have today, which is presumably what you wanted to discuss, which is, Cold War Part 2. In this case, it's China, and it's the West. And Russia has, again, this kind of uneasy relationship with China, but they just recently signed a tens of billions of dollars worth of trade deal between those two countries. And so basically Russia is feeding China the energy it needs in order to continue building. And so China now has a steady, reliable source of energy, whether it's natural gas or oil, from Russia. And in exchange, Russia, of course, gets much needed currency in order to keep and prop up its economy, which is much smaller than China's right now. And so that's what we're looking at now. And then China has done a fantastic job of infiltrating many of the institutions, of stealing intellectual property from the United States, from Canada, and other Western countries. They've done a phenomenal job of paying off bureaucrats, paying off politicians, bribing people, and blackmailing people. I mean, we all know about the Biden laptop situation. It's nice to see Hunter coming out admitting finally, well, yes, that could be my laptop. Yeah, maybe that story in the New York Post wasn't such a piece of fake news after all. And Twitter coming out, yeah, it's okay, I'm rubbing their face in it as much as I can. Oh, it's a story now, is it? But that's really what we face now. And China is a much more serious and dangerous foe than I think the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had, of course, the nukes, And so they could, of course, there was always that. But China has been much better at infiltrating, undermining, for instance, buying up huge chunks of Hollywood and the media, of course, and politicians, which now are pretty much in the pocket of China. I mean, politicians go over there and fall into honeypot situations where they end up, in bed with Chinese prostitutes in hotels. China has been doing this for years, and through these activities has been very successful in compromising many of our institutions in this country. And we're in a real battle with these people to save the freedoms that we have.
That was an interview with Canadian radio host Mark Petroni out of Mississauga, Ontario. I will now be playing another clip by Mr. Beat, the teacher who does the history lessons with the YouTube channel Mr. Beat. This is going to be going over the 1984 presidential election.
Mr. Beat presents Presidential Elections in American History. The 50th presidential election in American history took place on November 6th, 1984, on my 3rd birthday. Yep, this was the first presidential election I was alive to witness, although I don't remember it at all. Man, I guess that means I'm almost finally done with this series. Wow. Anyway, Ronald Reagan was easily renominated as the Republican nominee after a strong first term. The economy had rebounded, and many Americans seemed to credit Reagan for getting the rest of the world to respect the country more. Sure, the government didn't shrink much, and military spending went way up, but that seemed to be what everyone wanted. Reagan talked trash about the Soviet Union, but more discreetly took the beginning steps to help end the Cold War. Vice President George H.W. Bush was also easily renominated. This was the only time both a vice presidential roll call and presidential roll call were done at the same time. While at least 8 Democrats sought their party's nomination, only 3 won any state primaries. One was Jesse Jackson, a civil rights activist and Baptist minister, and the first African American to be a serious contender for the presidency. Another was Gary Hart, a senator from Colorado who became the main rival to Walter Mondale, the former vice president in the Carter administration, who appeared to be the one to beat. Well, Hart came close, but Mondale came out as the winner. In a somewhat surprising move, Mondale went with Geraldine Ferraro, a representative from New York, as his running mate. She became the first major party female vice presidential candidate in American history. Mondale and the Democrats probably figured, what the heck, Reagan is so popular, we need to do whatever we possibly can to get the attention of voters to sway them our way. Despite his old age, Reagan was now 73, he seemed unstoppable. Still, opponents questioned how well he could continue to be the commander-in-chief at his age. In response, at one of the debates between him and Mondale, he joked,
"I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience."
Mondale criticized Reagan's supply-side economics, or more commonly called trickle-down economics, and called attention to the rising budget deficits. His solution? Raise taxes. Sure, the people love hearing that. Despite Ferraro becoming the first major party female vice presidential candidate, she didn't generate the excitement that Democrats had originally anticipated. And here are the results. Oh my goodness. It was a blowout. Reagan destroyed Mondale, easily winning re-election. He received 525 electoral votes. That was every state except for Mondale's home state of Minnesota and the District of Columbia. So yeah, Mondale just received 13 electoral votes. Reagan's 525 electoral votes are the most ever received by a presidential candidate. The popular vote wasn't quite as lopsided. Thanks, Electoral College, for deceiving us yet again. Reagan got 58.8%, which was still incredibly high, and Mondale got just 40.6%. Okay, I guess that still was lopsided. We now know that millions of Democrats even voted for Reagan. Anyway, Reagan officially became the oldest candidate to ever win a presidential election. The next month, a White House social aide asked Reagan what he wanted for Christmas. Reagan jokingly replied, quote, "Well, Minnesota would have been nice," unquote. I'll see you for the next presidential election, buddy.
"1985, this is the year I was born. We saw Back to the Future, which many would consider to be one of the greatest sci-fi movies ever made. From 1985, this is the song She Sells Sanctuary by The Cult.
And from that same year of 1985, this is just one of my personal favorite songs. It always makes me think of the Blue Ox in Bailey's Harbor, because it's just one of those songs I would listen to when I would go there and play pool. This is the Dire Straits, So Far Away From Me.
Here I am again in this mean old town, and you're so far away from me. And where are you when the sun goes down? You're so far away from me. You're so far away from me. You're so far I just can't see. You're so far away from me. You're so far away from me. Alright. I'm tired of being in love and being all alone when you're so far away from me. I'm tired of making out on the telephone, so far away from me. You're so far away from me. You're so far I just can't see. You're so far away from me. You're so far away from me. And I get so tired when I have to explain, and you're so far away from me. See, you've been in the sun and I've been in the rain, and you're so far away from me. You're so far away from me. You're so far I just can't see. You're so far away from me. You're so far away from me. Take it out. So far away from me.
Once again, my name is Miles Kristen, and you have been listening to the Whiskey Report on Corsair Radio, sponsored by Discourse Coffee, a liquid space in Sister Bay, Wisconsin.
1986, this was the year we saw the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, one of many John Hughes films to come out that decade. We saw the movie Short Circuit, we saw the David Lynch movie Blue Velvet. It was the same year as the Challenger disaster. It was the same year as the Chernobyl meltdown in Russia. But with so many stories that we could be talking about in the 1980s, there isn't exactly a good starting point because these are things that were going on throughout the entire 80s. You know, the crack epidemic, the outbreak of AIDS. We could be talking about the Iran-Contra scandal and when it was discovered or when it started. Iran-Contra, of course, this was where the United States were selling weapons to the Iranians. This is only several years after the Iran hostage situation, and we were selling weapons to the Iranians and then funneling that money by buying up large amounts of drugs in South America and then selling them to our government agents to then redistribute and sell to drug dealers and cartels. This is an insane case that happened, the Iran-Contra, for instance, where the only person who really got brought up on charges in the end was Oliver North, and nothing ever happened, and then he ended up getting a show on Fox News and even playing some roles as an actor. Iran-Contra scandal is a huge story that has so many pieces to it that you could not possibly explain the whole story in less than a few hours. And like I said, there's just so many stories. You could take so much time talking about the crack epidemic and how the Iran-Contra plays into that, of bringing drugs into the country, drugs that ended up on the streets. There were, people inside the government who came forward and said that we were personally bringing those drugs into poor communities. We could talk about the AIDS epidemic and how long Ronald Reagan completely ignored the situation. The 80s was a time when we had the Cold War, and we had this gigantic enemy that we were at war with, and even though it wasn't exactly a military battle, there are lots of people that got hurt because of the Cold War. And on that note, from 1986, this is the song by New Order, Bizarre Love Triangle.
like we were yesterday. I'm not sure what this
believe in reincarnation because I refuse to come back as a bug or as a rabbit.
You know, you're a real up person.
In 1986, the Smiths released the song Big Mouth Strikes Again.
Sweetness, I was only joking when I said I'd like to mash every tooth in your head. Oh, sweetness, sweetness, I was only joking when I said by rights you should be bludgeoned in your bed. And now I know how Joan of Arc felt. Now I know how Joan of Arc felt. As the flames rose to her Roman nose and her Walkman started to melt.
This is also from the year 1986, and this is also from Great Britain. Now, of course, everybody has heard of the band Radiohead, but did you know that Radiohead had a original band before that when they were in college called On a Friday? So this is the song Fragile Friend from Radiohead's original band On a Friday. In 1987, the stock market crashed over 500 points. This day was known as Black Monday. Here is a news story from 1987.
Good evening. Today is Black Monday, the day the Dow dropped more than 500 points, the day the Dow dropped more than 22%, almost double the rate of the Black Monday that signaled the beginning of the crash of 1929. But this crash of 1987 is not just an American experience. Around the world, stock markets fell faster than a skydiver without a parachute. The panic starting in Tokyo this morning while the West slept. One cause of the sell-off was reaction to last week's 236-point drop in the Dow. The result, the Nikkei average was down 260 yen. Then, like a plague, sell fever headed west. In Frankfurt, fears of higher interest rates in the U.S. triggered the drop there. In 2.5 hours of trading, the Commerzbank share index fell 132 points. In London, an even larger drop. The British market, trying to cope with Friday's national computer failure, was thrown into a near panic. The result, the London Financial Times index down more than 183, the biggest one-day drop in Britain's history. And from there to Wall Street, where the numbers speak for themselves. Unofficially, the Dow stands at 1738.41, a drop of more than 508 points, with a volume of more than 604 million shares. Proof, as Alec Roberts reports, that the panic hit a fevered pitch.
From the opening bell, the market was in free fall. After last Friday's record 108-point loss, analysts had expected a rally. Instead,
it's panic. Everyone's in panic. Everybody, we're trying to find a bottom. We're trying to, as a floor broker, I see stocks trading 10 points below where they traded Thursday, and I'm saying this has to be the bottom. And then they trade 5 points lower than that.
By noon, the market was down about 150 points. The tape delayed by more than an hour. But it only got worse as trading brokers struggled to cope with a blizzard of sell orders.
New Mexico, we have some work here to do.
Since the market hit a high of 2,722 last August, it lost 17.5% of its value to 2246 by Friday, and another 508 points today.
More and more analysts believe that the bear market is here to stay. It's not that the economic news is so much worse. In fact, some indicators are showing unexpected strength. It's the psychology that's changed. While for 5 years investors have looked at the economy as a glass that is half full, now they're seeing it as half empty.
Reasons for the decline have been floating around for months. An accident waiting to happen, according to one analyst. Renewed inflation fears with a decline in the dollar, rising interest rates, and huge budget and foreign trade deficits, a nation living for too long beyond its means. The results of the decline will hit millions of people in their investments, pension plans, their mutual funds, and eventually every segment of the economy. Higher interest rates, for example, will hurt the housing market. Even normally optimistic analyst Larry Wachtel doesn't see a quick recovery.
What usually happens in cases like these where the psychology has been so scarred is that once there is a technical rally back in which people unload on the rally, then you go through a long quiet period. The people that got out don't want to get in. The people that wanted to get in aren't sure about whether they want to get in now. And so you go through a long quiet convalescence period.
President Reagan, however, was more optimistic.
Where our productivity is up, so is our manufacturing product up. There is no runaway inflation as there has been in the past. So, as I say, I don't think anyone should panic.
In New York, this is Alec Roberts reporting.
And now from 1987, this is the song Just Like Heaven by The Cure.
angels dancing in the deepest oceans, twisting in the water. You're just like a dream, you're just like a dream. Lift me into shape. I must have been asleep for days. Moving lips to breathe her name. I opened up my eyes and found myself alone, alone, alone above a raging sea. I stole the only girl I loved and drowned her deep inside of me. You, soft and lonely, you, lost and lonely, you, just like heaven.
And now in 1988, after 8 years with Ronald Reagan as president, George Bush ran for president in the 1988 election, and so I will once again turn to Mr. Beat to concisely tell us the story of an American election.
Mr. Beat presents Presidential Elections in American History. The 51st presidential election in American history took place on November 8th, 1988. It was the earliest one I actually remember. By many accounts, Ronald Reagan had a solid presidency. He helped end the Cold War, and the economy remained strong. But there was some bad stuff too, like the Iran-Contra affair, in which the Reagan administration secretly sold weapons to Iran in exchange for hostages, but also to pay the Contras, a rebel group in Nicaragua. Oh yeah, and it was later revealed the CIA was also sneaking in and selling millions of dollars worth of cocaine and sending the profits it made also to the Contras. But most Americans didn't know about that. And when Reagan appointed George H.W. Bush, his vice president, as the best man to be his successor, many Republicans were on board. Bush did face some challengers, though. One that stood out was Bob Dole, the senator from Kansas, who was Gerald Ford's running mate back when they failed to win the election of 1976. Another was, believe it or not, Pat Robertson, the former Southern Baptist minister and media mogul. In the Iowa caucus, Bush came in third, behind both Dole and Robertson, but Bush rebounded, eventually taking a strong lead to easily win the Republican nomination, with Dan Quayle, a young senator from Indiana, as his running mate. Quayle was a controversial pick among Republicans, though, because he was criticized for his lack of experience and sometimes stumbled over his words. The Democrats had the seven dwarfs. No, not those seven dwarfs. These seven dwarfs. Okay, that was sort of mean. But it's what critics called the seven leading contenders for the Democratic nomination. They included Jesse Jackson, who was back for a second try, Al Gore, another young senator from Tennessee, Bruce Babbitt, the former governor of Arizona, Joe Biden, a senator from Delaware. Delaware? Sorry, Delaware. Then there was Richard Gephardt, a U.S. representative from Missouri. Paul Simon? No, not that Paul Simon. Yes, that one. A senator from Illinois who looked very good in bow ties. And finally, Michael Dukakis, the governor of Massachusetts. Now, the Democrats tried to recruit New York Governor Mario Cuomo to run, but he declined. Then there was Gary Hart, who at first seemed destined to become the nominee and the party's leader of the future. However, the media all of a sudden decided to pry into his personal life, and as it turns out, he was cheating on his wife. Many of his supporters turned against him after they found this out, and he ended up suspending his campaign because of it. With no clear frontrunner, the Democrats had a long and exciting primary race. In the end, it was Governor Dukakis who got the nomination. Jesse Jackson finished second, and his supporters argued he should be Dukakis' running mate because of that. But Dukakis disagreed, instead choosing Lloyd Bentsen, a senator from Texas. The Bush campaign aggressively attacked Dukakis. Bush capitalized on the word liberal, which was now considered by many a dirty word to call a politician. He called Dukakis a liberal when it came to everything. A guy named Lee Atwater helped circulate rumors rumors to the media that Dukakis' wife Kitty had burned an American flag to protest the Vietnam War, even though it wasn't true. Bush argued Dukakis was ignorant when it came to the military, and Dukakis responded poorly to these criticisms and rumors. I mean, he staged a photo op where he rode around in a tank to try to prove he knew military matters, and it backfired horribly. That, a poor debate performance, and the fact that Bush was capitalizing on a good economy and Reagan's popularity all greatly hurt Dukakis. And here are the results. George Herbert Walker Bush easily won, becoming the 41st president in American history. He received 426 electoral votes and 53.4% of the popular vote. Surprisingly, since this election, no candidate has been able to match or surpass these numbers. Michael Dukakis received just 111 electoral votes and 45.6% of the popular vote. Bush became the first sitting vice president to win a presidential election in 152 years. The last one was Martin Van Buren back in 1836. Dan Quayle became the 44th vice president in American history. Bush had campaigned as the candidate who promised to never ever raise taxes. We'll see if that holds up. I'll see you for the next election, buddy.
And you just heard another amazing clip by Mr. Beat. I would definitely recommend people check out his YouTube channel. It's just Mr. B-E-A-T, Mr. Beat, putting together amazing history lessons on anything from presidential elections to Supreme Court decisions. He also will do interesting comparisons between states or cities, and he puts together all sorts of history lessons into very short videos on YouTube. Check him out, Mr. Beat. And now, from 1988, from the musician Q Lazarus, this is the song Goodbye Horses. And here's one more song from 1988. This is by the group NWA. This might be one of their songs that has less swear words in it. This is Express Yourself.
I'm expressing with my full capabilities, and now I'm living in correctional facilities. Cause some don't agree with how I do this. I get straight and meditate like a Buddhist. I'm dropping flavor, my behavior is hereditary, but my technique is very necessary. Blame it on Ice Cube, because he said it get funky when you got a subject and a predicate. Add it on a dope beat, and it'll make you think. Some suckers just tickle me pink to my stomach, cause they don't flow like this one. You know what? I won't hesitate to diss one or two before I'm through, so don't try to sing this. Some drop science, well I'm dropping English, even if Yella makes it a cappella. I still express yo, I don't smoke weed or sex, cause it's known to give a brother brain damage, and brain damage on the mic don't manage nothing but making a sucker in you equal. Don't be another sequel. Spread yourself. Do it good. Spread yourself. Ice Cube, it's not for the pop chart. So where should a brother like you start expressing yourself, my boy, and show you how? Yo, Trey, what up? Drop English right about now. Getting back to the PG, that's programmed, and it's easy. Dre is back, new jacks are made hollow. Expressing ain't the subject because they like to follow the words, the style, the trend. The records I spin again and again and again. Yo, you're on the other end. Watch a brother blend, dope rhymes with no help. There's no fessing or guessing while I'm expressing myself. It's crazy to see people be what society wants them to be, but not me. Ruthless is the way to go, they know. Others say rhymes which fail to be original, or they kill where the hip-hop starts. Forget about the ghetto and rap for the pop charts. Though some musicians, cause at home they're scared to use profanity when up on the microphone. Yeah, they want reality, but you hear none. They'd rather exaggerate a little fiction. Some say no to drugs and take a stand, but after the show they go looking for the dope man. Or they ban my group from the radio here in WA and say hell no. But you know it ain't all about wealth, as long as you make a note to spread yourself. Do it good. Spread yourself. Do it. A lyricist, yo, Dre is a name for to make something dope on a record. That's what he came for. Kicking reality, yo, but staying itself. But it's important that you keep it in mind too. From the heart, cause if you wanna start to move up the chart, then expression is a big part of it. You ain't efficient when you flow. You ain't swift, moving like a tortoise, full of rigor mortis. There's a little bit more to show. I got rhymes in my mind, embedded like an embryo or a lesson. All of them expression, and if you start messing, I got a Smith & Wesson for you. I might ignore your record because it has no bottom. I get loose in the summer, winter, spring, and autumn. It's Dre on the mic, getting physical, doing the job. And WA is the lynch mob. It's a macabre, but you know you need this. And the knowledge is going just like a fetus or a tumor. Well, here's the rumor: Dre's in the neighborhood and he's up to no good. When I start expressing myself, yell slam me. Cause if I stay funky like this, I'm doing damage. Or I'ma be too hyped and need a straight jacket. I got knowledge and other suckers lack it. So when you see Dre, a DJ on the mic, ask what it's like we're getting hyped tonight. Cause if I strike, it ain't for your good health, but I won't strike if you just spread yourself.
And that was Express Yourself by NWA. My name is Miles Kristen. You have been listening to the Whiskey Report. As we wrap up the 1980s, we would definitely need to talk about 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, in many ways signifying the end of the Cold War, the end of the USSR. The 1980s could be defined by so many things, the good and the bad, the amazing music, the amazing movies that came out of it. It could also be defined by people like Ronald Reagan, the AIDS epidemic, the crack epidemic, and so many tragedies like losing John Lennon and the Challenger, the Chernobyl. There are so many things we could talk about as far as the 80s. Like I said before, the Iran-Contra scandal is probably one of the most significant of all, and there's so much that went into that. But looking back on the 80s, I probably focused a lot on the British and dance music that came out, because that's just my favorite of all of it. But to leave today, I will be playing one last song. This is an early song by the Pixies. This is Wave of Mutilation by the Pixies. Once again, you've been listening to The Whiskey Report, and I am your host, Miles Kristen. Thank you for listening.
Cease to resist, giving my